This is Laborc, and it is so nice to have you here. These are the paints you need. First, we cover the whole skin with doombull brown, leaving the extreme shadows black. They are not extreme because they are snowboarding all day, they are just super dark. Papa Laborc using a base layer consistency. Don't forget to cover both of her butt cheeks. Granny Laborc would be so mad if she saw this lady with an attire like this. You wouldn't guess it, but she's not the biggest Nicki Minaj fan. Alright, glaze over those shadowy parts to smooth out the transition between black and this nice reddish brown. To do that, thin your paint and offload your brush like it's a racehorse to avoid smudgy blends and start the brush stroke in the dark area and move it to the bottom part. No back and forth, okay? No Mickey Mouse. We only do this one direction and one direction only. Otherwise, I will slap on your tiny hand. Now let's mix some skrag brown to the doombull brown and sketch some highlights. Oh, by the way guys, I'm sure you didn't notice, but the face of this miniature is terrible. She is missing her nose, and also there is a huge mold line on his forehead through his whole face, but at this stage Papa Laborc was in the classic denial phase. Sure, Papa Laborc throws some paint at the mold lines, that usually solves everything. Ignore that she doesn't have a nose, you can paint around it. Just paint the rest of the face, no one will notice that she looks like a Michael Jackson superfan. Don't worry guys, I will fix this, but denial takes time usually. Okay, you know the main highlight places for the face. Cheeks, nose, forehead, chin. Little bit on the lower abs, and don't forget the hands and most importantly, the butt cheeks. Those need to be crazy smooth. I'm painting the mini as light is coming from the left, if we look at it from the front. So Papa Laborc placing the highlights according to that. Let's reduce the highlight areas with skrag brown. I'm using thin layers so that helps me with the blending as well. These Massive Darkness 2 minis are true scale 38mm, so use a pair of magnifying glasses or lamp if your vision is not the best. They are weird to use it at first, but after a session or two you'll get used to it and they are not very expensive. Now let's glaze again with the same method we used before. Dilute the paint and move it in one direction toward the recent highlight color. Add some sunny skin tone to the skrag brown and reduce the highlight areas even more. Our focal point is the face. That's why it sucks we don't have a nose, but don't worry, we'll get there. Use very thin layers while adding these highlights so we can keep the face smooth like Granny's butt cheek. To achieve maximum smoothness, you don't fiddle with the paint too much. Once it starts to dry, you move to the next area until the previous layer dries completely. Since we are using acrylics, it's not a long process, but it's crucial to wait for the layers to dry before applying more paint. I didn't record it, but I painted the eyes after this step with ivory and black. I'm sorry guys, but I just can't do it without holding the model like 6 cm away from my face, and sometimes I can't record that. For the final highlights I used sunny skin tone. Again, super thin layers and we don't need maximum opacity with this color. We just push the contrast more to enhance our focal point. Alright, let's move to her shirt with the Dragon Balls. I covered the whole thing with waagh flash. It's a nice and cold green and covers greatly even with one layer. Not to mention it looks good with these warm skin tones. Highlight the shoulders and breasts like the light is coming from the left with sybarite green. Try stippling around the spherical shapes to make your blending game easier. Don't let the paint flow into the recesses or I slap on your tiny hand and those black lines between the cloth and the skin are super nice to have, so please don't get rid of them. Use some glazing to blend in the new color. To increase the contrast, I reduced the highlight areas with Gauss Blaster Green. Very thin layers and mostly stippling. Every time you apply a new highlight color, you want to keep some of your previous layer too, okay? Okay. Between the balls, LOL, I used sybarite green and covered them with black to have some nice definition and pre-blacklining them. After that, I covered them with skrag brown. Remember to leave a tiny bit of black rim where the ball connects to the fabric. It will look really nice and clean and it's worth the extra effort. Cover the top part of them with trollslayer orange. It might take a couple of layers, and make sure to use the right consistency so your paint is not runny, to have perfect control over it. For the lower part of the beads, I use lugganath orange. Try to follow the spherical shape and remember to leave that black rim, or I will slap on your tiny hand. Lastly, a tiny bit of ice yellow on the top left part on the balls, and now they are so shiny and smooth like Granny's butt cheek. This was the part when I got tired of her nodes. I mean, by the absence of it. So I grabbed a little bit of green stuff and made her a new one. Okay, for the hair, I used rhinox hide. I want it to be a bit darker than the skin. Leave some separation between the hair and the face because we want to emphasize that it's a different section and not a part of the skin. After that, sketch out the highlights with doombull brown. We don't pick the hairs one by one, we just create shapes that follow the mass of the hair. Then with tuskgor fur, we do paint some locks of hair, but only where we want brighter values for the highlight. Reduce the highlight areas with this mixture. As you can see, the hair looks much different than the skin, which is great. Now, adding a bit more sunny skin tone to the mix, we paint the final highlights on the hair. Really thin consistency and try to leave some of the previous layer. Alrighty, with the hair done, we move to her lower robes. I start with the base layer consistency of XV88. I leave only the extreme shadows black between some recesses. Make sure your layer is nice and opaque once you move on to the next step. Okay, let's glaze over those extreme shadows with a diluted consistency. Just a couple of layers to smooth it out. For the highlights, I add some morghast bone to get that yellowy creamish color going. I use a thinner consistency and build up the opacity with multiple layers. Remember to wait for your layers to dry before applying the next coat of paint. With thin layers, it's basically the same thing with glazing. Try to use the same motion with your brush so your paints will dry to a smooth finish. If you don't believe me, just play around with your brush on the same part for 2 minutes. It will become quirky and horrible and you might rip off previous layers of paint. So for Granny's sake, don't do that please. After that, I applied pure morghast bone with the same consistency as in the previous step. I simply reduce the highlight areas and cover less and less of the previous color we used. You can do some edge highlights where the rope has some thin edges, and only use this color for the folds that are facing up. This fabric is not as reflective as a metal, so counter reflections are not really a thing. It could be if we paint it like silk, which is a very reflective type of cloth. But in this case, it's not. Cover her pants with doombull brown. We want to make it orange, and it's a nice way to start it with a reddish brown. Especially because we use this color for the skin too, it will create a more integrated look. For the second layer, I use skrag brown. This is more of an orangish brown. Since light is coming from the left, I cover more surface on that side. The area between her legs is blocked by her hand and the other legs, so that's where our shadows go. You know guys, we don't want to make our life harder than it is, so don't try to apply highlights where it's hard to reach with your brush. To push the values, I used some sunny skin tone and picked out some folds that are facing up. You don't need full opacity here with this layer, and we won't push for higher contrast because we don't want these pants to look super reflective. To smooth out the transition, I will glaze over this a couple of times as well. Let's increase the orange hues with glazing some trollslayer orange next to these highlights and mid-tones. Just a couple of layers again. Now for the hand and leg wraps, I used grey brown. This is a bit tricky part because we want to keep the black lines between the folds, so it's kind of a back and forth process. Not only that, but it's kinda hard to black line between them because these folds are not that crispy. So be patient or I will slap on your tiny hand. To highlight them, I use morghast bone. Try to use a thin consistency but not too thin that it would flow into the recesses of these wraps. Patience is really the key at this point, to make these wraps as defined as we can. Lastly, I add some white to the morghast bone to push the values. Same consistency and same motion with your brush. Alrighty, after that I cover that strap on her back with doombull brown. Then I start working on those jewels. I cover the rim with XV88, this will be a super simple golden MM. Try to leave the gems itself black, and try to leave a tiny black line between the gold binding and the gem. This will make it look nice and defined. These gems are a bit different color than her shirt, so I will use the mix of ahriman blue and hydra turquoise, but you can use the same colors we used for the shirt, it will look just as fine. After that, I add some sunny skin tone to the mix and cover a bigger part on the top of the gem and the smaller part on the bottom, leaving the middle part with the previous layer. Finally, I paint a tiny part with ivory to make these gems shiny like granny's eyes. To finish the gold bindings, I paint 80% of the surface with zamesi desert, aiming for the top left and bottom right part. Lastly, add a tiny bit of sunny skin tone to the top left part inside the zamesi desert layer to create a small glint. It's easy and fast, and you can do all the rest of the gems just like this. Now on the concept art, she has some turquoise makeup on her lips and face. I painted them with the same mix we used before, but I rather skip those two tiny spots on her cheeks, because at this scale it will look like a smudge. Lastly, I add some purple hue to the shadowy parts of the clothes and face. It's a very diluted glaze consistency and it will add depth to the shadows so much more. 3 to 4 layers should be fine enough though. And there you go guys, now we have a monk to play this awesome dungeon crawler. Hope you guys have fun painting her, and don't forget to share your results with Papa Laborc. So thank you for joining me on this little painting adventure. A huge thanks to my Patreons who support these kind of videos. With special shout out to Jonathan Rhodes, Cold-Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Rulzak, Vlad D, Urtepel21, Paints and Games. If you wish to support Papa Laborc's work, you can do that on Patreon, where you will have early access to these videos and you can vote on the next one. If you prefer some one-on-one painting lessons, online coaching is now available. I hope the rest of your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.